Welcome to Muffin Talk.
Kia ora and welcome to Muffin Talk. This program is brought to you by the initiative Titipounamu, Study and Joy. In today's interview, we are remembering Sister Elaine Wainwright, who passed away on the 5th of July, 2024. Dr. Elaine Wainwright, a Sister of Mercy, was an Australian theologian and biblical scholar who was known for her feminist scholarship in Matthew's Gospel. I interviewed Elaine in 2015 during her time in Auckland. Here is a snippet of one of my radio interviews that I did with her then.
Sister Elaine, I understand that you've specialized in reading the Bible ecologically. What does that mean?
That really has arisen out of the ecological issues that have faced us in our times, and it's trying to come to the biblical text with the lens that is being shaped for us by the ecological movement, by the new cosmologies that scientists are proposing for us, etc. So it's bringing that perspective to the reading of the text.
So when did that start, this reading ecologically? Is it a movement that started in the 20th century?
It's like some of the other particularly contextual readings of Scripture, like the liberation justice reading, the feminist reading at the end of the last century. And the ecological movement has been, in a sense, gathering pace in our world, particularly with the threat of climate change. But it's probably approximately 20 years since scholars have begun to do this work, but it's again a movement that's gaining strength as time goes on. More people are being involved in it.
And you are a professor of theology, and you're currently undertaking an ecological reading of the Gospel of Matthew. Why did you choose Matthew?
That's very simple. I chose Matthew because that's the gospel that I have worked on for most of my time doing biblical studies. I started out doing a feminist reading of the gospel for my PhD, and so it's the gospel that I'm most at home in, of drawing in the scientific knowledge that we have about our world and drawing that into our engagement with the Gospels and with our sacred texts.
Can you give me an example of how you can draw it to the Gospel? Like you are focusing on Matthew. Do you have an example?
I think at the heart of reading the biblical text in a different way is our way of thinking. I think that's the primary challenge for us. And I learnt that, I think, when I was doing feminist readings as well, that you almost need to have a shift of consciousness. One of the people that I read talks about thinking ecologically. We almost need to learn to think ecologically in our lives, and then we bring a new perspective to reading the text. So, for instance, in the Gospels, let's say the temptation of Jesus, we would normally read that focusing on Jesus, the human character in that, whereas an ecological reading places that human character in and very strongly in the context, in the material context, the context of the desert. So what does the desert mean? What are the implications of desert? You know, how does that give a particular perspective to the reading? And that in some ways is possibly an easy one. It gets more difficult. One of the things that I did in a most recent article was to look at animals and the way that animals are used to teach with, in a sense, in the Sermon on the Mount. And I think it's reading, in a sense, almost against the grain of the text to bring those animals, because they're there in the text, to bring them much more to the fore and not not use them just as ciphers for us as human community to think with. It's trying to shift our consciousness to realise that we are one element, one player in this great drama of the earth, and that we're with the, what I would call the other than human, and it takes a lot of work for us to think about and be very conscious of the other than human.
And I was just thinking, when you focus also on the animals, how would you do that? Would you try to... I've heard some talks on the radio where somebody thinks that, okay, I'm now this and this animal, and I see it from my perspective. Is that what you are doing?
No, it's not. It's not quite that. I think some of that may happen at the end of a biblical process, and I'd call that creative articulation. You know, like retelling the story creatively after having done the work, but. Much of my focus is on actually doing the work and trying to uncover what is in the text that we've missed before, and that in some ways catches us up into a cyclical process of, we come with a growing ecological consciousness. We read the text for seeing it much more broadly as a canvas, as a story in which the human and the other than human functioning together, and it's bringing to the fore or foregrounding what we've tended to miss. One of the things that I've used almost as a little slogan for my reading of Matthew is reading for habitat, the human and the holy. And so habitat catches up all that is other than the human and the holy, because normally we read for the human and the holy in the Gospels, and an ecological reading wants to incorporate and to gradually shift us to realise that the earth which we inhabit in fact is very material and cannot be separated from the human and the holy, whereas the Industrial Revolution has separated the habitat and all that is other than human. It's diminished the value of that, and I think we need to correct that particular perspective.
Can you give us an example of, you mentioned Jesus' temptation, or another example, whatever you would like to choose, and to tell the story the way that you'd read it or you'd hear it in the church, and the way that you would read it or perceive it as if you do the ecological reading.
Right. I'll use an example because I've just been working on this. In some ways, it can look an easy example, but I'm not sure that it is. And that's the parable of the sower. Clearly, that's got all sorts of other than human elements in it. You've got the seed, you've got the weeds, you've got the edge of the path, you've got all sorts of sun and wind, etc.
Just to summarize that story of the sower first, so for those who don't
know that, it's actually not called a parable early in Jesus' proclaiming of it, but it's this, in a sense, little vignette about a sower going out to sow, and some seed falls on the wayside, and the birds of the air come and pick it up, and that's another other than human element. Some of it fell on the pathway and it didn't shoot up, and some of it fell amongst weeds, and the weeds grew up and choked it, and then some of it fell on good soil, and it produced 20, 60, 100-fold, I think it was. I think it was those three. And in a sense, well, even the Gospels themselves, and this is a little bit problematic, I discovered when I was doing my work, even the Gospels have the disciples asking Jesus for an interpretation of that parable. Now, my suspicion is that that's probably the later community wanting to know what the parable means. Parables are very evocative stories. I think they open up the world for us. Interpretations of them close the world down. Mm-hmm. You know, the seed is the word, etc., etc. And so you may find people staying with that interpretation that's actually in the gospel. But I think that makes it very one-dimensional then. Whereas one of the things that I think that struck me in working on that parable was just the almost the richness and the joy of the whole agricultural process, you know, of sowing seed, of the earth receiving it, of it growing up, of the sun giving it life, of weeds being there, that everything's not perfect. There are weeds, there are rocks, it can fall on rock and so it won't spring up. But there's something extraordinary about that whole process. And if we jump too quickly to saying this equals this, we don't allow ourselves to be attentive to that, and I think it's then that attentiveness. So if we can read that parable and then be attentive when we see growth happening, when we see seeds being planted, that's a way into making us more ecologically attentive, as I was saying before. Like the reading of the text should be shaping us to be thinking and then living ecologically. So I think that's the sort of thing that can happen if we're attentive to habitat and all that makes up the habitat of that story, not just the human and the holy.
So it's you look at all the little details and what it makes for the plant to grow. You see the plant in it, whereas some interpretations already say this is just a symbol for this, and this is a symbol for that. Whereas the same symbol could be used for different interpretations.
That's right. It's interesting, even just listening to the text, I think one of the aspects, it ends up, at the beginning it says, it's an invitation, listen, and then it says, behold, idu is the Greek word, and that's always something that asks us to pay attention. And then it ends, that little story, little parable ends with the statement, let those who have ears to hear, hear. So I think the story is not meant to be interpreted in that one-to-one, this equals this, but rather, what are the ears that we need today to hear that, so to hear it ecologically? And we've just talked about some of that, but I think one of the key factors is in the yield. And I've had a look at some of the ancient documents where writers talk about yields, and the tendency has been, because I think we've not always understood it, to say the yield is extraordinary and so, that's got to do with God. But I think those yields were issues that were problematic in Galilee at the time of Jesus, because the Roman Empire was trying to buy up and force out more and more of the small landholders. And so they were getting these big estates, creating these big estates in the agriculturally rich areas of Galilee. And there's a wonderful coin that I've got a picture of that was minted by Agrippa I, who was the ruler in Galilee from around 38 to 44, I think. And on one side of this coin are these 3 ears of wheat or corn that are just absolutely bursting, with seed, and they come from the one stem. So one stem and three. So probably 100-fold. And on the other side of that coin, it says basileus, which is the word for emperor or king. It's not emperor in this instance, but rather King Agrippa. So Basileus Agrippa. I think that's what that story is meant. It's meant to evoke for people that there's a struggle here over in a sense, who owns the earth and its produce? Does it belong to the emperor? And that coin that's what it's wanting to say. Or do whatever the yields are, whether it's 20 or 60 or 100, is that part of the right relationships? Wrong relationships are when there's power over that grain and its abundance, or for the community to be challenged to be in right relationship with that. And so it's the right relationship between habitat, human and holy.
Yeah, the taxes were, in former times, they were often collected by yields.
Yes,
the harvest,
that's right.
Part of the harvest had to go to the emperor or to the owner of the...
And so then the emperor is claiming that he is the source, or the king. Agrippa is claiming that he is the source of that production.
Produced for him.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Sister Elaine, for coming and for this interview. It's been a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Beata.
Out there, heroic peace is calling. In the bonds of love we meet. For the world a new day dawning and shine.